we're going to have a chat now about, does culture eat strategy for breakfast? We've got a really interesting panel set of experts here who are going to help us have this discussion. We have Dan Chesterman, who's the CIO of the ASX. Everyone say hi to Dan. Dan.
Thanks very much for the clap.
You don't know. Dan has actually held many CIO roles within financial services for the likes of CommSec and various parts of private banking for CBA. He's also lived all over the world. He's had 11 years management consultancy experience and lived in so many places I cannot name them, but definitely lived and worked in quite a few places. So we're really glad to have Dan on the panel, because when we're talking about does culture really eat strategy for breakfast, we really want someone who's living and breathing that challenge right now, because culture is critical to talent retention, and we've just seen that talent retention is probably the biggest thing that's holding us back at the moment. We've also got Dr. Christine Derry, who I know very well, who lives a double life. She actually lives between Boston and Sydney and working for MIT CISA. So really researching employee experience, the future of work, all things that are very integral to healthy cultures and retention. So she flies back and forth. And the really interesting thing about having Christine on the panel is she really understands Australia. She's worked for many research organisations at Sydney University. Also, you actually set up digital disruption group as well in Sydney. So she's done a lot of work locally, but she's back and forth to Boston as well. So that gives her a really interesting viewpoint of all the multinationals, what's working, what's not, and really getting into different headquarters in the US as well. So we're really excited to have you here, Christine. And we have Colin. Thank you for coming, Colin.
Thanks for asking me.
No, Colin is an internationally acclaimed specialist in organisational culture. So he's an international speaker. He's a best-selling author. He does a lot of coaching with organisations on how best they can lead their teams and drive culture. He's also worked all over the world. I think he's got about 20 years transformation experience in the UK, Australia and New Zealand. So I think we've got a pretty strong panel around experience around culture and transformation, because that's the world that we're living in. We are living in transformative times. You know, things are going to continue to change. What we want to try and talk about today is how best we can balance culture and strategy, and really, I guess, chew the fat a little bit around what is that balance, how do we work out what it is, and how do we execute that at the end of the day to the best will of our employees. So I'm just going to ask some questions of my panel, and then we're going to throw it out to the audience, so make sure you get your questions at the ready. But I guess I wanted to ask you, Colin, because you do speak to a lot of people globally. Why is everyone talking about culture at the moment? Because it does seem to be the big thing that everyone wants to talk about, which is great for you, but tell us why.
It's great for me, Bridget. Oh, because it constantly appears at the top of consultants' reports. Deloitte's particularly produce a human capital trends report every year. Leadership and culture, they remain the top two challenges for organisations, doesn't matter where you are in the world. Culture is something that we talk a lot about. You know, I jokingly call it the C word, and we're liberal with the C word, and we talk about culture a lot, but we don't really invest much money in it. We're very good at quick fixes. You know, agile is the latest thing, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my my closing speech. Things like Go in Open Plan, which is proven not to work, are seen as quick cultural fixes, just like office refurbs. And I think what we're trying to do...
Proven not to work? Tell us about that.
Proven not to work, yeah. So it was a Harvard review released just last month, and 73% of the organisations surveyed said it reduced collaboration, didn't enhance it.
Wow.
Yeah. But we're still doing it because it's easier than actually, sitting down with the staff and getting them to agree what's the right way to do things around here.
Right.
It's way easier than doing that. Just bring a firm of people in to change the furniture around. Throw a few bean bags down, that'll work. So I think there is this recognition that if we don't have the right culture, if we don't have the right way of doing things around here, organizations, they look at people like Atlassian, they look at Amazon, Netflix and Spotify, all these people, they've got great cultures. And then they forget that actually what they do is they involve the people in the definition of that. Dom talked about that at the start, and about hiring for values, and the fact that he could be the same person in Atlassian. He'd never come across that before. There was a work Dom and a social Dom, and he was able to bring those together. And that's what great cultures do, is you can be who you are, but they spend time figuring out personalities, communications, getting the right working environment for the right kind of work. Yeah. Really putting the emphasis on, well, how do we deliver effectively in a way that everybody enjoys?
Yeah. Great. Okay. It's about 50 things we could speak about there. We'll come back to that. But Dan, as a CIO, because I know the role's changing so fast, and we're actually becoming much outwardly facing rather than inwardly facing, and all of these types of themes. How much more involved do you feel the CIO is in culture?
So, quite a lot more, I'd say, and for some of the reasons that Bob touched on earlier, as well as some of the things that come through in the survey results you just walked through. Many organisations, certainly my experience is they're starting to become more inherently technology oriented, because the way that they deliver services is increasingly digital. That a lot of banks and financial services organisations have spent time thinking, are we still a bank or are we a technology company? And I think that conversation, even the fact that we're having that conversation, it illustrates how important technology is, not just to the culture and the tone within the IT team, but actually more broadly across the whole organisation.
And do you lead it, or are you part of it?
I think it has to be a little bit of both, frankly.
Yeah.
The tone, I think, does start from the top of the board, the executive, the business strategy, but certainly my experience at the ASX is that there's a lot of technology or IT savvy commercial people, and then there's an expectation that the technology folk are also increasingly business savvy, if that makes sense. So I think you are in both sides of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And Christine, with the research that you're looking at around culture, and I guess because we are here talking about finding great people, engaging them and keeping them, what are you seeing in the research? What themes are you seeing come out that are perhaps surprising?
I think some of the things that we're seeing is that companies that really invest in these great employee experiences, and that's not just the technologies and the space and all of the things that create the environment or work environment, but it's how do people make some of these decisions and have the right conversations. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to talk next about the business outcomes for companies that are able to make those kinds of investments and build those employee experiences. So I don't think we can separate culture as such from the capabilities to deliver the work. I think those two things are very integrated. Mm-hmm. We talk about habits. We prefer to talk about culture as a series of habits, because in these large organisations of ours that have been around a long time, the ones that are not digitally born, that most of us are from, we've got habits that have been built up around command and control. Mm-hmm. And that's how we've become good at what we do. So now we've got to change those habits. And when we start thinking about them more tangibly, then we can isolate them. We can understand more that people under stress will fall back into old ways of doing things. Mm-hmm. And so they need more support and help and coaching in order to be able to change some of those habits. They're not going to happen overnight. So those are the kinds of things we've got to start thinking about, not just the technologies, but the other things that sit around it.
Sustainability of it. Yeah. Because Dan, you and I have spoken about a few different things around culture and healthy cultures, and how do you get a measure on what is good and what is perhaps not as good as you think it is. What do you think are the blockers, like in all your experience? Like what sort of things have you seen perhaps block good culture?
So one thing that would stand out, I think, is, and maybe it's even the way that the panel, the term of it, Does Culture Eat Strategy for Breakfast, makes it look like there's a binary. Yeah. You can have good strategy and bad culture, or bad strategy, good culture. And I don't think that that's true. I think one of the things that can really ruin a culture is a lack of coherence between what the organisation is trying to achieve, its purpose, how it can execute, and then also its culture. So that if there's a lack of coherence between those three elements, execution ability, strategy and culture, I think that can actually be one of the things that really brings it unstuck. A good example of that, I suppose, without being specific about organisations, is just how hard it is for organisations after a merger to actually achieve the value or get the success that they are seeking. Many mergers, I think, look good on paper. Their strategy is sound, but it takes a long time to change a culture or establish a new culture, if you like, from a merged organisation. And I think that's just almost an accidental experiment in how that can play out if strategy and culture aren't aligned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Peter Drucker allegedly said that, allegedly, we love this, not in his books, but allegedly said, does culture eat strategy for breakfast? And it's thrown around by management consultants a lot. I think we're all probably nodding there. Not saying anything bad about them, but just saying I think that they do utilise that quite a bit. I mean, what do we really think of that statement? Because it's quite a grand statement, isn't it? If you think about it in real terms. Who wants to take that? Because it's really what we're here to talk about. Does anyone have an opinion?
I'll take it.
Go on then.
Yeah, I'll take it. And what he meant, he was talking to the then CEO of Ford Motor Company, allegedly, when he said it. And he talked about the fact that you can have the best strategy in the world, but if you don't have a great how we do things around here, then it's kind of pretty much useless. But Dan's absolutely right. You need both. You can't have one without the other. You still need a good strategy. But, as a permanent employee for 30 years and 20 years working, predominantly in IT, it used to frustrate the crap out of me just how much of a big deal we made strategy. It's a massive opportunity to start to collaborate with the business, to bring people with the business, IT and the business, or to work with our peers in different areas. And yet it always used to be done by that guy there. It was always a guy as well. On a desk on his own, he would tell you exactly. And it became an information gathering exercise that took like 4 or 5 months. And it ended up being a document this thick that nobody would read. And I think, one of the opportunities that we've got culturally moving forward is to make it a much more engaged, a much more collaborative approach between IT and our partners and our peers. Present the information in a way that's not only engaging, but people actually want to read it, they want to interact with it. Not only that, and Dan and I very briefly talking about this concept of shadow IT, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Honestly, I really don't believe that it is, because what you want is that level of interest. Sure, you don't want to, kind of disempower yourself, but you want that level of interest so that you can collaboratively and cooperatively build a strategy. But then crucially and a part of the strategic intent is, well, what's the kind of culture we need to actually deliver this? Because cultures evolve all the time, and yet for too long what we do is like, that's the culture we've got. And then we use things like, our culture change is hard. Well, it is if you're saying it. Immediately that's what everyone's going to think. Yeah. And so I think, as part of that strategic intent, what you've got to do is really say, okay, well, what's the culture we need, or how do we need to evolve in order to deliver that?
If I could, sorry, Kristen,
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add to what Colin said about shadow IT. It's something that I think, it's actually a very good thing if you've got technology folk or experts playing a role very, very close to the business they're supporting and executing fast. And there's a very lack of divide in the team that's working really, really closely. But I suppose what it does rely on is that there's the culture and in some cases the technology capabilities that allow that to happen without it creating next year's legacy or next year's mess or a cyber risk, because at the same time we're worrying about those sorts of things. So we've sort of come to the conclusion that there are some parts that need to be really, really quite controlled, like architecture, infrastructure, cybersecurity. Yeah. And then on top of that, there's actually a lot of technology now that allows the actual development to be done very, very close to the business. And if we call that shadow IT, it's in their budget and it's executed by them, that's actually something I'm very comfortable about. Yeah. I'd rather not have a larger team, if that's the answer. So.
And when we talk about teams, because that's part of the strategy, and we're saying that we probably can't find full-time employees very easily, potentially with the skill sets we need in our perfect strategy. And we're then talking about hybrid teams, and how we complement the workforce. I'm just thinking about this because that's it's a very big part of the strategy for the CIO, because they know when they write the strategy they may not find all those people. But how do we keep the culture when we start having contractors and partners and what have you? What sort of secret sauce do we have around this? Because I know some of the research Christine shared with me definitely shows there's a decrease in employee satisfaction as you increase perhaps more flexible labour.
Yeah, I think that there's a large part of creating this culture. What we've seen in organisations is around how do you enable these conversations to take place, and whether those conversations are taking place within your full-time employees, or we are all going. 97% of IT departments are made up of these hybrid relationships between contractors and full-time employees, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But to enable those conversations to take place, people have got to be skilled and have the knowledge and the capabilities. Otherwise, it's very difficult for them to actually have really informed and to make collaboration more than just talking at each other. So what we want is collaborative organisations, but there has to be a sense of, we've got the skills to be able to do that. We're seeing a huge investment in learning and development platforms right across these companies that are really more mature in their development, and a lot of those platforms are designed to really change the culture, to get people thinking differently, and then extending those platforms out beyond just the full-time workforce, but to enable those platforms to then be readily accessed across a more hybrid workforce. So I think that that the maturity around that is really shifting, and the readiness to invest in not just the platform itself, but also in the skills required to engage actively with the platform. These sort of self-directed learning skills. Yeah. And that's a big part of the culture that we're trying to grow. Yeah, because I think that engagement piece, when they can self-curate, really increase, rather than this is what you're going to learn. Absolutely. It doesn't work quite so well these days, does it? Unfortunately. Yeah. Just joking. So, Dan, with sort of, I guess, culture within, the organisations that you've worked for, because clearly you have to come up with a great strategy and then, make sure that you've actually got a plan in place. When you're looking for leaders, because I was just coming back to behaviours and future-proofing skill sets for the future, and behaviours and attitude and what have you, what are you looking for in some of your leaders that are going to help you on a transformation? So I suppose one of the key things that I'm looking for when I'm hiring someone into my team is actually that maybe two things would be very strong values and ethics, and I know that maybe comes ahead of the technical capabilities, and then the ability to actually communicate really coherently across technical and non-technical folks. So I see the role that the leaders within my team are playing is actually one of stitching together quite a long-running narrative that is motivating for people who don't understand technology or might be scared of it, people who are technology experts but need to be lifted up and feel a strong sense of purpose. So it's those sorts of skills which I think, for me, there's table stakes. They need to have competence technically, but then beyond that, I suppose the differentiating factors that would actually make me hire people is more in those areas.
If I can just jump in, because it's a good point, but with this thing called leadership, right? We've made it too hard, we've made it too big, we've made it hierarchical, leaders at the top, workers at the bottom. We've made it a development program now, which is cool that we give people the knowledge, but it's always been a choice. It's always been a choice to be different than everybody else, to stand up, to be courageous, to speak up when others aren't speaking up, is to display the behaviours that other people aren't displaying, to turn up on time for a bloody meeting when everyone else is late, to put your device away when everyone else is. This is what leadership really, really is. And these are the kind of things you look for in other people, because they're the people that you want to elevate, because those people create followers, and then they create more leaders by default. And then all of a sudden you've got people who are willing to step up and take accountability and responsibility when you need them to. And then you lose this sense of there's a real leadership gap. Because actually you've just got a few people who are courageous enough to go, hey, there's a different way, and it's a humanistic way, exactly as Dan said, and it's something that we need to do more of. Now, you still need to know your stuff, right? It's not good enough just to say, I don't know anything about cloud or cybersecurity. You've still got to know your stuff. You've got to have a real mix of IQ and EQ. But it's the EQ stuff we've downplayed it for too long. We even call it soft skills, when these are the hardest things to change. Yeah. And that's the real differentiator for people who are leaders.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's a very, very big. I think it's a very big challenge, though. I think that as we've sort of said, it's not one we just fix it and then the culture's right. I mean, how often should people be having a close look at their culture and engagement? Do you think?
For me, from the research that we've seen, this is a totally iterative process. This is not something you do, once a year, once every 2 years, and go, okay, I'm done now. We're on the right place. We've got the right culture. It's iterative. It's changing all the time. And I think a big part of it too is elevating the voice of your employees, so that you can find different people who are leading in different ways, who have got different ways of responding to problems, and giving them a voice. And that's the value of some of the technologies that we've now got that we haven't had before, this sort of democratization of the voice that enables us to go into those little dark corners of the organisation and shine a light and say, hey, listen, there's Jane over there who's doing this amazing job with this little team that we didn't even know about. Now we can share that knowledge and expand those principles and build the culture and these kind of little cubes, around the organisation.
So do we actually think then that culture trumps strategy? I mean, we've kind of touched on it, but what are we saying?
I think they're highly interdependent.
Yeah.
Because I think that the strategy, you do need to have a strategy. You do need to make choices about where you compete, how you compete, where you're going to put resources, what capabilities you need.
Yeah.
I think you need to focus on execution ability, which is probably not in that culture and strategy, but I think it's also true. But if you have both those things perfectly and the culture is not supportive, or you're tolerating, if you like, a gap there, then I think you won't succeed either. So for me, it's interdependent and needs to be mutually reinforcing.
And in support of that, what I would say is you spend as much money and time on your culture every single year. I still can't believe it's not a line item on people's OPEX as you do on building and driving your strategy. If not more money, move away from the quick fixes and focus on that continual evolution. The culture evolution programs that I run, we're talking to staff every 2 months to find out what's new, what's different, elevating people and fixing things and introducing new ideas. So it never feels static. And so this concept of always delivering strategy, it always feels different. It always feels new. It always feels energized, and people are inspired by that, and they want to be part of it.
I wonder if Peter Drucker chose breakfast intentionally. I mean, allegedly, if he said this.
Allegedly did.
Because I wonder if...
Phone him and ask him.
Yeah. One of those things, where you ask the author, why did you choose breakfast? And they go, I don't know. I just kind of thought about it.
I like sausages.
Yeah. Because I wonder if it's... there's something to do with it being... There's a foundation element here. If you've got the right foundation and you're able to have some of the right conversations, and that means that we've got some of the right skills in place, we've got a learning organisation, we've got the ability to share, ideas across the organisation, then some of those strategic changes can happen, and it makes it easier for those to happen. So the rest of the meals, isn't the idea you get the right breakfast and then the rest of the meals kind of enable you to grow from there much more effectively? Oh, I could be taking this metaphor a little far.
I think you're making it sound amazing.
I'm starting to get hungry.
Yeah. No, I think, as we're sort of saying, they're both equally important and interdependent, as Dan was saying, because people need to buy in to deliver your strategy. And I think execution is an absolutely fundamental part of this. Okay, so do we have any questions from the audience around this topic? Yes, we do. Is that Malcolm? Yes, it is. I've got my glasses.
I thought it was a microphone. I'll stand up. Malcolm from GXT. Colin, you mentioned the stats you gave about the fallacy, if you like, of the work environments we're talking about within an office. But of course, a lot of us are so if you where they're working remote working, etc. Have you got a corresponding perspective on that remote side?
Yeah, Malcolm, and it's a really good point. I was very fortunate to spend some time at Cisco here in Sydney, and they had a bit of an office refurb, and what they did is they created spaces for different personalities. So we know statistically that open plan offices kills introverts. They stick headphones in. When the headphones go in, they block out culture. And certainly for the organisations with a more disparate workforce or a virtual workforce organisations that I've worked with, is we bring everybody together at the start, and we include contract staff, because too often what you do is you exclude them. It's almost like, this is our culture and you're not part of it, and then we wonder why they see themselves as different. And we talk about what's the right space for you to do your best work. As a former public servant, I headed up projects. we were open plan. It's what we got, and we weren't allowed to change it. So I commandeered a meeting room for a year. You're not allowed to do that, Colin. Well, I did. And we called it the library. And we stuffed it full of IT textbooks, and we made a bit of a joke of it, and you weren't allowed to take drinks in there or food, much like a library. And the fear was from my boss that, people are just going to go in there and spend all day in there. And of course they didn't. They went in there for 2.5 hours a day to do their best work, and then they would come out and be part of the team. There's no easy answer, because what you need to do when you think about the culture and the environment you need for people to do their best work, it's going to differ everywhere. Malcolm, so we had a team of testers out in India who were largely introverts, and they just wanted a cubicle to work, and it was like, okay, cool, but we still had a collaboration space where we needed to do stand-ups, where people could go temporarily and then they went away and back to the and at the end of the day, providing we got the job done and providing we got the product delivered, the quality was good in a way that the customer was satisfied, we were happy with that. It's just where it wasn't right. We used to survey people all of the time and ask them questions all of the time. It's like, okay, well, what can we do differently? What things are people telling us? Kind of the water cooler conversations. Do we need to bring them out of the kitchen? Where do we need to put those? Mixing socially is another one. Is you've got a load of extroverts who want to mix socially, you've got a load of introverts who don't, and you have to find the happy medium, and that's when you bring them together and go, okay, well, what does good look like? And actually, it might be an hour at 4 o'clock on a Thursday where people get together before they leave work. And you make that a part of the culture. I'm not sure if I've answered the question, Malcolm. I just enjoy the sound of my own.
Malcolm, let me just add a little bit to that, because we've, in our research, we statistically looked at space to see what the correlation was between particularly open plan, more contemporary kind of looking workspaces and business performance. And we found no correlation at all, no correlation between new contemporary work spaces, open spaces, and business performance, unless it was part of an integrated employee experience strategy. And when it was part of that, then the correlation went up exponentially, hugely. So I think this is about really thinking about what it is we want our people to do, and how we need them to do it, and what the nature of the workforce itself is going to look like, so the work and the workforce, and then making sure that this is an integrated strategy around space, as opposed to a separate, one that's formed over here by a property or facilities department, and then we all have to somehow live with it.
Because that's the thing about culture. Culture is the sum of everyone's attitudes, beliefs, behaviours and traditions, and it's the attitudes, beliefs, behaviours and traditions that hold us back traditionally, because we don't cooperatively go out and say, hey, what do we need in order to deliver successfully? So when you do that, it becomes part of an experience, and people want to say and they want to be part of it. They might be reticent to begin with because they've never done anything like that before, but as soon as you make them part of it, then they're really, that's when engagement goes up, and they go, okay, this feels different. And I actually get a say in what it is that we need in order to be successful.
And I think that more holistic inclusion piece is really important, because the data tells us that 7 in 10 people that work in the IT industry in Australia were not born in Australia. So you've got lots of people with lots of different, and you've all worked globally. So there are nuances, and people are motivated by different things. So I think that lens is really important, rather than, as you said, sort of just shoving it down their throat and telling them what they're having.
I'd say that's particularly true. My experience in Australia is that you don't have to travel globally to have a multicultural workforce. We have, I think, 53 languages that are spoken within the ASX, which, including one person who speaks 7, but she's great. But the reality is we have to recognise people want to bring their full selves to work, and creating that environment is fundamental.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? There's got to be. No? Only Malcolm being brave.
Malcolm's got another, I think.
Malcolm's like, I have another one.
Well done, Malcolm. Yeah. Is he a plant?
Yeah.
He's a good friend, but not a plant. Bridget, the outsourcing stat, I'm going to go back to that.
Yeah.
So quite a dramatic shift in that, but the question was around, are you going to spend more on outsourcing?
Yes.
So, basic stats will tell you if you've been increasing what you've been spending on outsourcing over time, then at some point that rate of increase will flatten off. Mm-hmm. So the answer may not be in the data, so therefore it's a more generic question, which is, have we sort of reached peak outsourcing, or did we actually reach peak outsourcing a couple of years ago? Because the corollary question of will you be spending less on outsourcing, obviously it wasn't there in the data, but it could be that there's even more who are actually now going to spend less. So
Yes.
I guess it's a thematic
Yeah.
around outsourcing and where the temperature overall beyond just that one stat that we saw there sits.
No, thanks, Malcolm. I think Dan and I were talking about this the other day because it does depend on the maturity of the business and how close they are to their customer on that transformational journey, because I think perhaps for the last decade, people have kind of gone, oh yeah, outsourcing, woo. You know, even though we say we're really good at it and we do the stand-ups and we do all those sorts of things, I know, you know, part of our service lines is outsourcing. But I really do think there's an appetite now for the business and the CIO to just be closer to the customer, be able to see the data themselves, respond quicker, and really get under the skin of what's happening a little bit more real time. So it depends what it is. I still think, and as you were saying, a lot of the heavy lifting, like infrastructure, you know, those types of things have been done and have been significant investments. Whereas I think the more digitally, or not digitally, but doing business with your customer and I guess customer experience piece, we're actually we think we need to have a little bit more control of that, and that may ebb and flow, but I think at the moment in Australia, a lot of companies are going through significant transformation where they are trying to do business, you know, in a different way. So I think that perhaps, you know, it'll come back, but probably not at the levels that it was at. What do you think with outsourcing? Do you, Dan, have a view?
So my personal perspective is that maybe it's also just a term that's run its course. You know, we still will be sourcing capabilities in lots of different ways. Some of it will be as a service, you know, or cloud, or, you know, maybe from a digital agency. We might not call all of those things outsourcing, but essentially they might well be sourcing capabilities from outside your organisation. In some cases, we've now automated the role that was previously outsourced. And so I think as a strategic theme, it's probably less front of mind for a lot of CIOs. My guess is that's probably something that also might feed into the survey results.
A lot of people sort of think partnerships.
They might call some of the similar things quite a different name as well.
Yeah.
Or they might take a different form fundamentally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the question is still around how we're going to create a workforce that can deliver on all of the things we need to be able to do. So, and what we're seeing is that companies that are investing in employee experience, I'm going to do myself out of a keynote in a minute because it's but companies that are really investing in employee experience are able to make very different choices around their workforce. So they're able to choose very differently which skills they want to have as FTEs in the organisation, and which skills they want to source either through the gig economy, freelancers, you know, contractors, whatever arrangement they're going to have. But that economy is not necessarily being used to prop up their labour force, but more to add different skills when and where they need them. And, you know, create this environment where you're bringing in new opportunities and new experiences constantly, but choosing how you kind of curating that workforce is going to be the most important thing going forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the whole, I think we've understood, and Colin, you've done some great work around identifying toxic behaviour and eliminating and, you know, making environments much more pleasant. I do think there's another step change that we're talking about here around culture, which is, you know, speaking up and I think just having a voice and feeling comfortable, and that's, I think we're on that journey, but I think we've still got a significant path to go. I think Christine and I were looking at some research earlier that suggested that 94% of organisations feel that they need an innovation culture to be successful, which is high obviously, but I think it was, how many people are actually achieving that?
Yeah, well, actually only 26% of companies see it as important to their strategic success.
It's a bit of a gap. So we've still got quite a bit of work, I think, to do, which is, I think, part of the challenge. But I honestly do not think there's been a better time to be leading IT departments. We've got, and this is another thing, people buy into believing in the person that's leading, you know, their transformation or their technology department, and the CIOs have the ear of the board, you know, they're leading the business, and I think, Dan, we were talking about this, it's really your responsibility to your team to step up and... Yeah,
I agree entirely. I think, you know, some of the stats, that point around the budget growing, the cyber being front of mind, I think the role of the CIO is sort of ever more critical, not just leading the technology team, but actually helping the whole organisation understand how technology will change the risks and the opportunities that are in the environment. And it's a fantastic time.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Appreciated that.